So, good evening and welcome to the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Catherine Hellerstein, and I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program at Penn. I am welcoming you to, on behalf of the co-sponsors of tonight's lecture, the Jewish Studies program, which I direct, and the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures, chaired by Simon Richter, and of which I'm a member. I welcome you to Penn's annual Kristallnacht commemoration, which is a Kutchen seminar. We thank Dr. Joseph Benatov, Associate Director of Penn's Jewish Studies program and a scholar of Bulgarian Jewry, for suggesting tonight's speaker. Yesterday, November 9th, 2020, marked the 82nd anniversary of what has become known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. On November 9th, 1938, the Nazi government in Germany organized anti-Semitic pogroms throughout Germany and Austria, which destroyed Jewish homes, businesses, synagogues, and lives. For the past 15 years or so, the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures and the Jewish Studies program at Penn have held a lecture to commemorate this terrible event, which initiated the mass destruction of European Jewry. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Devin E. Naar, is the Isaac Alhadeff Professor in Sephardic Studies, Associate Professor of History, and faculty at the Strum Center for Jewish Studies at the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. A former Fulbright scholar with a PhD in history from Stanford University, Dr. Naar has transformed the University of Washington into a major center for the study of Sephardic history, culture, and language. His first book, Jewish Salonika, Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece, won a 2016 National Jewish Book Award and the 2017 prize for Best Book, awarded by the Modern Greek Studies Association. His current book project investigates the multifaceted experiences of Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews with American conceptions of race. While he conducts research in 6 languages, Dr. Naar speaks his endangered ancestral language, Ladino, with his 2 small children. Professor Naar's talk tonight is called From the Ottoman Empire to Auschwitz, Sephardic Jews and the Holocaust. He will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we'll entertain some questions from you, the audience. Please write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. When the time comes, I will read out the questions and Dr. Naar will answer them. So please join me in welcoming Professor Devin Naar.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. And I hope you can see me too. It's a real pleasure to be at Penn virtually, at least. And I'd like to thank Catherine Hellerstein and Chrissy Walsh, as well as Joseph Benatov, for making the program today possible. And thanks to the Jewish Studies program in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures. I grew up in New Jersey, not so far from Philadelphia. So maybe on another occasion I'll have the chance to come back to the East Coast. I'd like to begin tonight's discussion with a story. And there's a genre of story in the Sephardic tradition known as the conseja. These are stories that are told to entertain and to educate. And sometimes they're told, they have kind of maybe a moral involved. They tend to be anonymous, but I'll tell you a little bit about a kind of a more personal story. And that begins when I was in college. I was attending a community-wide Holocaust commemoration, and before the program began, I was chatting with one of the other attendees. She was an elderly woman, and she had inquired about what my connection was to the program that evening. And I explained that my grandfather's oldest brother, Salomon, and his wife Esther, pictured here, and their two children, Benjamin and Rachel, were murdered in Auschwitz. And the woman asked, where were they from? And I said they were from Salonika in Greece. And she paused to process what I said for a minute. And she replied, well, that can't be. I was a prisoner in Auschwitz, and I never met a Jew from Greece. I was really struck by it. I didn't know what to say, to be honest. I mean, here it is, a Holocaust survivor in front of me telling me that my own family's experience of the Holocaust couldn't be possible. It was a very strange kind of, perhaps even a form of unintentional, but still shocking Holocaust denial. And the response also revealed apparently that she had never encountered, that she had never had to think about. She never had the opportunity to address or begin to comprehend really the full scope of the Holocaust in terms of its geography, in terms of its cultural impact, in terms of its destruction. I mean, we talk quite a lot about the decimation of Yiddish culture, Eastern European and European Jewish civilization, but there were other Jewish cultures that were impacted. The Sephardic, one of the Sephardic Jewish languages known as Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, it was also decimated. And in fact, it was that language that brought me to that Holocaust commemoration in the first place by a kind of circuitous route. And that was around this time when I was just beginning my college career. I began to ask more about my family background, about this city of Salonika, about the place, these geographies of Greece and Turkey and the Ottoman Empire and the Mediterranean, that I discovered my peers, and even in the classes that I was taking, was not really part of their radar, not really part of the consciousness about the Jewish experience. And I remember asking one of my relatives, my great uncle, if he had any documentation that would reveal the fate of our relatives that stayed in Greece. In fact, they didn't stay in Greece. They'd come to the United States. Uncle Solomon and his wife, Uncle Solomon had come to the United States. After World War I, he returned, thinking that the new regime in Europe, the minorities treaties, would provide new opportunities for Jews. And then by the time that he tried to come back again, the United States had passed its Immigration Restriction Act, and they tried for nearly 15 or more years to get a visa, and they were denied every single year. And so they were not able to join the rest of the family in the United States. But some of the documents that I was able to uncover from my great uncle began to tell their story as they wrote letters, 1938, 1939, 1940, and then there's nothing, and the letters pick up after the war in 1945, 1948, 1950. And one of the very first letters is written essentially on the eve of the Holocaust. I don't want to give it away just yet. On the eve of the Holocaust, on the eve of Kristallnacht. And they were written in this script that you see here. And I remember asking my great uncle, he shows them to me, and I said to him, well, what is this? I had, high school level knowledge of Spanish. I'd heard Ladino from the elders in my family growing up, and I had, basic knowledge of Hebrew. And he said to me, he says, well, that's Spanish. And I said, come on, that's Spanish? What do you mean that's Spanish? He says, well, that's how we used to write Spanish, in Hebrew letters like that. And I said, Hebrew letters? That's not Hebrew letters. I don't know if you're out there, if you know the Hebrew alphabet, if you can figure out what these letters are, if you're not familiar with the Sephardic style of Hebrew cursive known as solitreo, the most distinctive letter here is this one, this long, tall one here. A lot of people will say this is a lamed, but the reality is that it is an aleph. It looks like the Arabic alif, which has to do with the fact that Sephardic Jews developed their language and their culture in the context of the Ottoman Empire, in close proximity to their Muslim neighbors compounded by the fact that Hebrew and Arabic are their sibling languages to begin with. So this says, por mis queridos parientes, caro papa. For my dear parents, beloved father. And this was a letter written by my great aunt Esther to my family, to my great grandfather, who was a rabbi in Salonika and subsequently in the United States, first in Harlem in New York, and then in New Jersey and New Brunswick at the congregation Etz Chaim, which is now in Highland Park, saying that they're trying to get a visa. This is again 1938. They have been unsuccessful. And they say essentially that their own fate is in the hands of the relatives in New Jersey, and they must do whatever they can to intervene, to find a way to get them a visa so they can come and reunite with a family in the United States. And for a variety of reasons, that was not successful, and they were not able to exit Greece, even as the conditions became even more and more terrible. So this was the language of my family, and this was a document on the eve of Kristallnacht, on the eve of the war, that revealed the family and their inability to get out. And I realized, going back to that encounter in college at the Holocaust commemoration, that in popular circles, in academic circles, in the public imagination and commemorations, Sephardic Jews, Jews who lived beyond the framework of geography that we normally associate with the Holocaust, in Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, of Jewish cultures not necessarily associated with those core stories, have been relegated to the margins of our conceptualization of the Holocaust and our conceptualization of Jewish history and Jewish culture, if they have not been written out altogether. Why? Why is this the case? And we can pinpoint many reasons, and I could give you an entire talk, in fact, on just the reasons to explain the marginalization or minimization of the experiences of Jews from places other than what we might say the heartland of Europe or of Eastern European Jewish, the Eastern European Jewish experience. Of course, one issue is the geography, but another one is demographics, insofar as Sephardic Jews constituted perhaps a few 100,000 in compared to the millions of Jews living in Europe and the broader regions of the societies in which they inhabited in the beginning of the 20th century. But other issues are conceptual, methodological, perhaps even political. Sephardic Jews, as a series of discrete communities, don't easily fit onto our map. And I mean that literally. Check out this map from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which refers to the major ghettos in occupied Europe. And Europe is the operative word here. So much so that if you can see here, we don't even get all of Europe and all of the Jewish communities that were impacted by the Holocaust. We have the city we're going to be talking about, Salonika, is marked there, but Athens is cut off. The island of Rhodes, which is just off the coast of Turkey, a little bit further south than is even available on this map, was also impacted, and additional geographies that I'm going to speak about in a moment. I'd like to suggest that our contemporary political framing of the Holocaust has something to do with it. Think about, for example, in 2005, the European Union and member countries have been observing International Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th. And the category of Sephardic Jews makes us think differently about the boundaries of Europe, of the boundaries of the nation, and the narrative of the Holocaust. Sephardic Jews are not just those that live in distant or exotic lands, mushed together as all the other Jews, the non-European Jews, the non-Ashkenazi Jews, the Jews of Muslim lands. They're perceived to lie, therefore, beyond the reach of the Holocaust, which continues to be conceptualized as a fundamentally European event. In fact, that's one of the new innovations of recent Holocaust scholarship, to Europeanize the Holocaust, to think of it as a continental process and event, not only a German-centered one, or not only one where we speak about, say, the ghettos of Poland, but a continental phenomenon. Those expanding geographic boundaries have provided an unprecedented range of new perspectives about the scope and the impact of the Holocaust. And the approach even provides us with an opportunity to expand a little bit further to bring us into those corners of Southeastern Europe. But I fear that the persistence of this exclusive European framework might actually hinder our ability to grasp the full extent of the catastrophe. How much room is there in a European, quote unquote, European narrative to grasp the experiences of the tens of thousands of Jews born in the predominantly Muslim world of the Ottoman Empire who perished in Auschwitz? Or to understand the factors that not only shaped Jews in Europe, but also those in the Middle East and North Africa? Right? Think about this. Nazi Germany established an empire across Europe, but that was part of a broader transcontinental imperial and colonial dynamic that was at play in the 19th and 20th centuries. There was the British Empire at play, there was the French Empire, the Italian colonial empire. The island of Rhodes, for example, was part of the Italian Empire at that time. And if we think about empire in this broader kind of framework, we might be able to expand our boundaries a little bit further. We might then have a place for the island of Rhodes. We might even be able to think of Greece in the framework of empire as a former Ottoman territory that had been granted independence only under the tutelage and authority of the great powers. It was appointed German and Danish royal families to rule them because Greece was not quite civilized enough to warrant their own independence at the beginning. We might include Turkey in this framework, which emerged as an independent state after World War I, following its liberation and the liberation of Anatolia from the French and British, while relinquishing territories in the Middle East that fell under new colonial rulers, especially those very same colonial rulers, most prominently the British took on Mandate Palestine. What happens to the story of Turkish Jews, thousands of whom had migrated to other parts of Europe? And when offered the opportunity to return to Turkey, the Turkish state actually denied them the prospect of returning to the country as part of a process of nationalizing Turkey, of Turkifying the country that resulted in the exclusion of non-Muslim populations, that resulted in thousands of Jews holding Turkish citizenship being deported to their deaths at Nazi camps, including Auschwitz. The story of North Africa during the Second World War is a very understudied subject, but this map doesn't even lay the groundwork for imagining what could have been the experiences of Jews in North Africa during the Holocaust. We have only in 2018 the first book, a collection of essays just beginning to unpack the experiences of Jews in North Africa during the Second World War by Sarah Abrevaya-Stein and Omar Baum at UCLA. A wonderful book. I would recommend it if you're interested in the North African experience. But if you look at this map here, you already get a way bigger sense of the geographies that are at play. If you think about Vichy France, for example, and the way that Vichy France had its own vast colonial holdings, French territories in Africa, in which there were hundreds of thousands of Jews that would also become subjected to anti-Semitic measures. If we think about French Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, if we think about Italian-controlled Libya, we have a whole nother universe that opens up. Thinking, of course, from the perspective of the Nazis, that if you go back to the Wannsee Conference in 1942, if you go back to the Nazis' plans for the final solution, the Jews of French-occupied North Africa, the Jews of Turkey, the 55,000 Jews of Turkey were included in that final solution. Okay, so even the framework of the Nazi authorities themselves, they were thinking beyond the continent. And I think it's important to take a broader view here. I think we can learn really and begin to appreciate the extent of the devastation that the Holocaust wrought, not only in Europe, as vast and as devastating that was. But that's not the whole story. Okay. I cannot tell you everything about all of those other vast geographies and cultures and societies in our few minutes together this evening. But what I'd like to do is tell you about this global event through a very specific local prism that helps us expand our boundaries, our conceptual, cultural, geographic boundaries of the Holocaust, perhaps of Europe and of the modern Jewish experience, by bringing us to the case of the Jews of Salonika, the city from which my own family comes, and the city that my counterpart at that Holocaust commemoration when I was in college hadn't even been able to fathom. We're going to zoom in here on the Balkan Peninsula in a region that was part of the Ottoman Empire. And now, if you think about the Ottoman Empire was a vast empire that encapsulated all of the Balkans, Bulgaria, and you have an expert there at Penn, Joseph Benatov. And so I'm not gonna detain us on the very fascinating case of Bulgaria. But that was once part of the Ottoman Empire. Much of Eastern Europe even was part of the Ottoman Empire, as was part of North Africa, the Middle East, from Morocco to the gates of Vienna, to Baghdad, to Jerusalem. That was once all essentially part of the vast realm of the Ottoman Empire, ruled from the Sultan's capital in Istanbul over here. And what was really distinctive about the Ottoman Empire was in some ways its diversity, and the way in which for quite a number of centuries, it was able to maintain somewhat of amicable and relatively peaceable relations among the different populations in a universe in which nobody had rights. Okay, that's the first thing. There were no rights. There were different degrees of privileges and opportunities, but there was no rights until the 19th century. In the case of Salonika, what was really unusual about Salonika was that it was a very important port city at sort of the crossroads between East and West. And it was a city to which, after 1492, when Jews were expelled from Spain, many wound up coming to the Ottoman Empire and settling in places like Salonika as well as Istanbul. Many of the Izmir, Sofia, Sarajevo, the tiny island of Rhodes. These became important centers of Sephardic Jewish culture in places in which the Ladino language to which I referred developed and thrived over the generations. Perhaps nowhere more than in Salonika, due to the demographic and cultural strength of the city's Jews. By the turn of the 20th century, more than half of the city's Jews were Ladino-speaking Sephardim. So influential was their role in the city that the entire port essentially closed on the Sabbath in observance of Shabbat. Jews were involved in every aspect of society. Many poor, and there were major class conflicts among the vast impoverished community and the middle and upper classes. But you could find lawyers and journalists and rabbis and teachers, as well as tobacco factory workers, hamals, stevedores at the port, lemonade sellers, pumpkin seed vendors, prostitutes, soldiers, everything in between could be represented in the city of the Jewish Sabbath, the Shabbatopolis, as it came to be known, the Jerusalem of the Balkans. So much so that figures like David Ben Gurion, who came to Salonika during the late Ottoman period, observed that Salonika was the only Hebrew labor town in the world in which you could find essentially a complete Jewish society, something that his counterpart from the right, Vladimir Jabotinsky, saw in Salonika, a model for what could be accomplished one day in the land of Palestine in terms of Jewish governance and autonomy. That entire universe would be transformed over the course of the 20th century as a result of a series of wars, the rise of nationalism, economic transformation, and many other processes that would result in the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, along with the Habsburg Empire and the Russian Empire, the redrawing of political boundaries, the emergence of new nation states in the Balkans and European colonial regimes in the Middle East, and that would transform what had been Ottoman Jews into Jews who are now part and parcel of these new emerging nation states. The invention of the Greek Jew, of the Bulgarian Jew, of the Turkish Jew, of the Yugoslav Jew would be part of this process that would have very devastating impact and produce very important challenges for these Jewish communities as they sought to bridge the divide from the Ottoman world, of which they had greater familiarity, in which they were one of a number of different populations, to the new world of the nation state in the region we're looking at on the map here, which generally was organized according to a different set of principles, that of the nation state, one nation, one people, one language, living within the framework of one geopolitical entity, the nation. And what if you didn't speak that language of the dominant culture? What if you did not belong to the dominant religion? What if you had a different history? What if you were perceived as belonging to a different race? What were your prospects for adaptation? What were your prospects for the future like in that region? Now, for a place like Salonika, for this region of the Balkans and Turkey, Anatolia, there was over a decade of war that bracketed the Great World War, World War I. In some ways, World War I was an extension, elaboration of the Balkan Wars that preceded. And the Balkan Wars themselves were waged in some ways over who was going to become the new owner of this very important port city of Salonika. That war, the Balkan Wars, were followed by the Great World War. And in the context of World War I, the entire city of Salonika burnt down, essentially, as the British and French allied armies occupied the city. Other cities in the region, and Izmir was also burnt down at the end of the war, essentially in 1922. And this is a rendition of this great fire of 1917 that left over 70,000 of the residents of Salonika homeless, including more than 50,000 Jews. It's a rendition, a sketch done by my father, who is a fine artist, a little sketch that he did. I thought it would be nice to share there. Give you a sense of the conflagration fleeing from the fire. But that fire and this war was part of a much broader, devastating demographic, political, and violent transformation in the region that resulted in Anatolia in the Armenian genocide, the murder of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman state. Many of them were deported on railroads built by Germans. So you have there some important foreshadowing there. And that would be followed in the wake of World War I by another major demographic transformation, which would be in the name of consolidating this new idea of the nation state. The term the nation state, by the way, does not exist before World War I. The idea that one nation and one state should be coterminous with each other, even the term did not exist. And in the name of solidifying that category, Greece and Turkey, which waged wars against each other in the wake of World War I, decided to resolve that conflict by swapping populations. They exchanged Christians for Muslims. So in the name of solidifying nations, they used religious identification as the building block of the nation. They expelled, with the authority and authorization of the new League of Nations, through a treaty signed at Lausanne in Switzerland, 1.5 million Christians were kicked out of Turkey and sent to Greece, and 500,000 Muslims were kicked out of Greece and sent to Turkey. And suddenly, overnight, in the context of the devastation of a decade of war, with the city of Salonika burnt to the ground, suddenly there are 100,000 Orthodox Christians who have arrived from Turkey, settling in Salonika as part of a plan of the new Greek state's desire to transform this Jewish and Ottoman city into a Greek city once and for all by engineering the new demographic framework for the city. Now, of course, the irony was that the terms of these new national developments, the terms of the exchange of populations were such that these were Christians who were arriving to Greece. They were Christians who were arriving to Salonika, which would soon take on the Greek name Thessaloniki as its formal name, an ancient Greek name and a Byzantine name for the city. But many of these Orthodox Christians coming from Turkey did not even speak Greek. They spoke Turkish. And they received not the warmest welcome from the Greek-speaking Christians already. So there are many different layers of displacement and tension across cultural, ethnic, and class lines. And it's within this context that Jews in the city, as across the country, are faced and it is demanded of them to transform themselves into Greeks. And what does it mean to become Greek? Can you be Greek? And this is a universal question. Can you be Greek and can you be Jewish? And what does that constellation of factors look like? And I want to bring you just one example here of a Jewish girls' orphanage, the Meir Aboav orphanage from 1926. And this is a really illustrative example, I think, of the tensions that were involved, the multiple kinds of cultural and political vectors that were at play here in this process of transforming Ottoman Jews into Greek Jews, the possibilities, the prospects, and the limits of that process. So here we have, it is a New Year's postcard. So we have a New Year's greeting in Hebrew. It says, Tisku leshanim rabot, which is the Sephardic New Year's greeting. May you merit many years is what it says. The traditional Sephardic greeting is not Shana Tova, which you may be familiar with. It's Tisku leshanim rabot. Okay, so it is advertising itself. What is the self-image that is being projected? We are Jewish, and this is our Sephardic way of being Jewish. And it names the orphanage in Ladino, in Hebrew script, the Orfelinato de Ijas Meir Aboav, okay, in Hebrew script. And then it gives you the year in the Hebrew date, 5687, with a Magen David, a Star of David, and the word Sion. This was actually an orphanage that was founded by Zionists. So there's another political vector at play. But we have yet more. If you check out here at the bottom, it gives the name of the orphanage in big font in Greek. Okay, so it says we are also a Greek institution, and it gives you the name in French. And French was a language of European culture and prestige. And to say, okay, we are Jewish, we are Sephardic, we are Zionist, we are Greek, we're also European. And we are also specifically Thessalonician. It says here Thessaloniki in Greek letters. And we are Greek and Jewish. We're going to be learning both of these languages, trying to meld them together. It says teacher in both Ladino and Hebrew on the chalkboard, and the teacher is pointing to the city of Salonika. Okay, so there's a lot going on. The young girls, by the way, have close cropped hair. They're wearing European style clothing. So this was their world. This was their world. And you mean, how did they hold all of those different identities together? This was not a problem. They could reconcile all of those identities. This is what it meant, in fact, to be a Salonican Jew in the period between World War I and World War II. There was enough space in their vision of identity and community and their aspiration that there would be enough space for them in the Greek state to hold all of these identities simultaneously. That did not prevent them from becoming victims of discrimination and of violence. And in fact, one of the unique features of this city of Salonika, not only did it have such a strong and historic Jewish presence and imprint, but it had not been the target of anti-Jewish violence in its very long history. In fact, there had been no history of pogroms in the city. The first real anti-Jewish violence takes place in 1931 in the context of the Great Depression, in the context of great economic strife, in the context of the refugees who had come from Turkey only a few years before, of them suffering. And it is those refugees who were principally responsible for perpetrating an attack against other impoverished Jews. So the circumstances there are very, very challenging. And when the Ladino press reports on this anti-Jewish violence, they use the term pogrom. And they said, what has happened to our community? Have we become Kishinev? This is what they say, which is a famous site of earlier in the 20th century where there were some pogroms in the city. They say, our status as the Jerusalem of the Balkans, it is now under attack. Is this a city in which we will continue to find a home for ourselves? What is our future like? One of the results of all of these transformations was outmigration. My family had left in the 20s. Others would go to the United States, some to France, thanks to the French cultural connection. Others in the 30s, especially poor workers at the port, would go to Palestine, where they would find employment at the port of Tel Aviv, Jaffa, and other places. Now, the dynamics in Greece continued to be challenging, and Jews continued to advocate for a sense of their own continuing place in their cities and in the nation. They continued also to have connections with the broader Jewish world. And one of the most interesting documents I found in my research, I thought, was this one written in Ladino, in the Solitreo, for the holiday of Sukkot. It's from the autumn of 1940. We just had Sukkot some weeks ago. And what's really fascinating here is there's probably at least one word you can identify, which is highlighted here, Auschwitz. And what this is a receipt of all of the ritual items that you need to celebrate the holiday. You need lulavim and you need etrogim, the citrus fruit. The island of Corfu was one of the most important exporters and producers of etrogs in the entire Mediterranean world. A colleague recently wrote a really great dissertation on the topic. And so Greece became in some ways responsible for supplying etrogim to other Jewish communities. And here we have a receipt saying that the Jewish community of Salonika has taken charge of sending the items needed to celebrate the holiday of Sukkot to the Jewish communities in Poland. And it lists here Krakow. And it says also that the ritual objects, these goods that are needed to celebrate Sukkot should also be distributed to a tiny town, Oświęcim, a Polish town that recently, already by this time, had been occupied by the German forces who had Germanized the city, and it had become known by a new name, Auschwitz. And it would be in that place, as you all know, where the infamous death camp of Auschwitz would be built. And it would be in that place where the small Jewish community of Oświęcim would in fact meet their fate. To think for a moment that the last Sukkot that the Jews of Auschwitz, the Jews of many places in Poland, were able to celebrate in the autumn of 1940 was made possible thanks to their connections with the Jews all the way down in the southeastern part of the European continent, on the sea, on the shores of the Aegean. It's really, really marvelous and fascinating to think about that, devastating as well. Even as the war began, already by this time, the war was underway. Poland had been invaded, obviously. But Greece was outside of the war. Greece would not be part of the war, and the Jews in Greece would look on with great reservations, be very concerned about what would be happening. Jewish refugees are coming to Greece from other parts of Europe. Some are going to Turkey en route to Palestine or elsewhere. And the Jews in Salonika continue to imagine a future for themselves in the city, in the country. They cannot imagine a future without Jewish life where they live. They are tied to these cities. They're tied to these places. So much so that in the spring of 41, we're deep into the war already, the Jewish community publishes a brand new prayer book. Fascinating. March of 41, by the Jewish community, to be used by Jewish children in the Jewish schools. Whereas Jews are getting expelled from other educational systems in Europe, actually in Greece, which did not have separation of church and state, the Greek state made provisions for Jewish students to study Judaism in Greek state schools, if you can believe that. So these new prayer books were to be used by Jewish students. And what's fascinating is there's a dedication in the inside front page in Ladino. And it says, en memoria del siempre regretado Shabbatai Henri Rafael Angel, caído en el campo de batalla por nuestra querida patria la Grecia. And it says, in memory of our much regretted Shabbatai Henri Raphael Angel, who has fallen on the battlefields defending our beloved homeland of Greece. By this time, Greece had been invaded by Italy, and Jewish soldiers among the population more generally came to the defense of their homeland. And many died. And here we have a new Jewish public saying, look, we are going to be Jewish. We have a future for ourselves in the city, in this country, and we're going to be part and parcel of our society. We're going to defend it with our lives. And what's fascinating again about this dedication, they didn't write it in Greek. It's not just a PR thing to show the Greek government or the Greek state, look, we are loyal and everything. It's to show them themselves. It is an internal discussion. Greece is now our homeland. It is our beloved homeland. We are willing to die for this country, even as we preserve our status as Jews. The Italian invasion of Greece is not successful. The Greek troops are able initially to repel the Italian offensive. Mussolini and Hitler are allied at this time. And the Italian defeat leads the German army to invade. And Greece is divided into several zones of occupation. The Bulgarian zone is in green there. And the Bulgarian zone of occupation story is a fascinating and devastating one. While Bulgaria proper itself did not deport its Jews, did not really cooperate, even though they were allied with Nazi Germany, it was the Bulgarian police that organized the deportation of over 10,000 Greek Jews from this region of Bulgarian occupied Greece to their deaths at Treblinka. And there were almost no survivors at all. So Bulgaria comes out with a very positive record in terms of not deporting Jews in Bulgaria proper, but was complicit in the deportation and destruction of the Jewish communities of Bulgarian occupied Greece. Italy takes control of the south of Greece, Athens, and other parts where there were many Jewish communities. All these little dots represent Jewish communities. There are over 20 Jewish communities. They control, for example, the community of Yanina, which was a historic Greek-speaking Romanio Jewish community that traced its roots to that region to the times of antiquity. They are called Romanio Jews because they've been living there since the times of the Roman Empire, and they never adopted Ladino. They continued to speak the Greek language. Okay, and the Germans take control of that part of north central Greece, the area of Salonika and its environs, because that's where the vast majority of the country's Jews reside. And here you can see some reconnaissance trying to count. There are over 20 Jewish communities. I gave you just a list of a few of them here. You can see there were, almost all of the country's Jews, demographically speaking, resided in Salonika at that time. And so it became the focus of the implementation eventually of the final solution. But, that's not something that comes right away. Initially, there is relative calm until the summer of 1942, when on a very hot day in July, all of the Jewish men aged 18 to 45 are called into the central square of the city to be registered for forced labor. By the way, the square is called Liberty Square because it is the place in which the Ottoman Turks had declared the Ottoman Constitution back in 1908. So the space of liberty is now transformed into a space of the removal, the stripping away of liberties. And thousands of Jewish men are hauled away to forced labor to work on Greek munitions. But what's really important here in this observation from one of the Jewish lawyers of the community is his reflections on the way in which the local Greek Christian population responded. Remember, I mentioned there were already some tensions between Greek Christians and Jews, especially the refugee population, but also the general Greek Jewish population, the Greek state, who is intent on transforming Jewish Salonika into Greek Thessaloniki. So you can see here, look, the satisfaction of the Aryan Greek population was indescribable. There are accounts of Greek Christians looking from the tops of the buildings as the Jews are being conscripted in this moment. Okay. In the wake of essentially the excision of the Jewish male workers of the community, with some important exceptions, the local Greek authorities undertake an initiative to try to resolve an issue that had been something of great significance to them for the previous 2 decades and more, as it related to the transformation of Jewish Salonika into Greek Thessaloniki. And that related to the fate of the Jewish cemetery. The Jewish cemetery of Salonika was the largest in Europe, if we can think of that term in a broader sense. There were 350,000 graves, twice as big as the vast Jewish cemetery in Krakow, and infinitely larger than the small but important and historic Jewish cemetery in Prague. Some of the tombs dated back to the ancient era, but most of them were after 1492. It was the size of over 80 football fields. As a result of that big fire I mentioned, and the resulting expansion of the city as it tried to rebuild, the Jewish cemetery became the center of what was in the process of becoming a Greek city. And the question was, can such a prominent Jewish landmark sit at the core of what was supposed to be a Greek city? This tension became even more acute as a new university propped up on the outskirts of the city, and it was looking over that very cemetery, hoping to expand. Already in 1936, the Greek papers are declaring that the space of the Jewish cemetery needs to be given up in order to make way for an expanded university campus. But the Jewish community, as assaulted as it was at this time, remained strong enough to deflect most of the efforts to expropriate the Jewish cemetery. And it would only be in the context of the German occupation in which local Greek authorities, the representatives of the Greek university, of the municipality, were able to implement long-standing plans for the removal of this very important Jewish landmark. And here you can get a sense of the depth. That's the university building here that's highlighted, how far away that was. What a vast sense of geography we are talking about here. And so it is at the initiative of the city of Salonika, the city hall of Thessaloniki, under the eyes of the German occupation, that the vast Jewish necropolis of Thessaloniki is destroyed in the winter of 1942. Workers paid for by City Hall come with their pickaxes and destroy the centuries of the imprint of the Jewish life in the city, in the destruction of the cemetery. Marble becomes one of the least expensive items you could find in the city. The bricks, they were expropriated. The cemetery became a mason yard. People came and hauled away the bricks and the marble to accomplish all sorts of projects, building in the city, to line latrines and to pave roads and parkways, to make the courtyard of the National Theater, the cafeteria of the yacht club of the city, all paved with Jewish tombstones. A swimming pool built with Jewish tombstones, this one done by German officials. It's fascinating though, with the inscriptions facing out. So you go under the water there and you get a look at those inscriptions. Here are inscriptions in Hebrew and Ladino and Hebrew characters. One of the most important churches of the city, the church of the city's patron saint, Saint Demetrius, which had been partly destroyed by the fire of 1917, tombstones were appropriated from the cemetery to refurbish and rebuild the church, to restore it to its previous beauty. And here, still in the late 40s, you can see piles of Jewish tombstones in the courtyard. And if you go there today, you will still see tombstones in the courtyard and in the backyard of the St. Demetrius Church, as in other places all across the city. stairs built from Jewish tombstones, what wound up transpiring over the next few years. The war is waging. The university, the city, would transform the entirety of the Jewish cemetery of Salonika into the campus of what is now the Aristotle University of Salonika, which is exactly the size of what was once the Jewish cemetery of Salonika, the size of 80 football fields, the largest university in all of Southeastern Europe. The fate of the dead anticipated the fate of the living. And here we have a very remarkable photograph, a very rare photograph of a Salonican Jewish family in May of 1943. This is a very rare photograph courtesy of the Foundation for the Advancement of Sephardic Studies and Culture, which is based in New York, the Gershon family. What I find striking about this image is this could be in maybe any other place, perhaps. They're wearing the yellow stars. And the Nuremberg laws and all of the kinds of processes that you might be familiar with from other parts of German-occupied Europe as it relates to the ghettoization and liquidization of the Jewish communities will begin to be implemented in Salonika as in other parts of Greece. What's remarkable to me about this image are the smiles of the two young women in particular. Because it's May of 43, they are wearing the Star of David, and they don't know what fate lies before them. They do not know about what has happened in Poland, or they do not believe if they do know. The deportation of the Jews of Salonika commenced in March of 1943. And in an unusual instance, in all the annals of the lands that the Nazis occupied, we have one case in which the leader of the national church speaks out in opposition to the deportation of the country's Jews. This is Archbishop Damaskinos, who is based in Athens, and he decrees in March of 43, according to the terms of the armistice, all Greek citizens without distinction of race or religion were to be treated equally by the occupation authorities. In our national consciousness, all the children of Mother Greece are an inseparable unity. Our holy religion does not recognize superior or inferior qualities based on race or religion. As it is stated, there is neither Jew nor Greek. If you know the New Testament, this is a reference to Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians, and thus condemns any attempt to discriminate or create racial or religious differences. It's a fascinating claim, a powerful one, in which many leading intellectuals signed on in Athens, saying we will not distinguish between our citizens based on race or religion. But Salonika somehow was different. Most of the Jews were there, and the dynamics were tenuous. Think about what the cemetery is being destroyed right now. How many religious and civic leaders, business leaders in Salonika sign on to Damaskinos' protest against the deportation of the Jews of Salonika? Greek Christian leaders in Salonika sign on to this protest. None. The trip from Auschwitz to Auschwitz from Salonika was 7 days. It was a very long trip. Not as long as the voyage that the Jews from the island of Rhodes, which is essentially, you can see the coast of Turkey from the island of Rhodes. It took them 23 days to get to Auschwitz from the island of Rhodes. They were deported in July of 1944, even after the liquidation of the Jews of Hungary, essentially. And it goes to show that even so late in the game, the mechanisms of the final solution were so in place that the destruction of the Jews was really the goal, more important than winning the war. That's the only way you can explain why the Nazis would exert so much effort in deporting less than 2,000 Jews from the island of Rhodes at the end of the war. Here we see a poem, it's really a song, by a survivor from Salonika who describes this experience. 7 days locked up. 7 días encerrados en vagones de behemas. Una vez a los 3 días nos quitaban a rear. Padre mía, mi querida, ya tuviste el zehut de morirte en tus tierras y no pasates por el Oluk. Padre mío, mi querido, ¿quién te lo iba a decir? Que vinieras con tu hermano al crematorio de Auschwitz. Padre y madre, hermano y hermanicas, saliendo todos reyagís. Al patrón del mundo, que me envíe salud a mí, que me quite de estos campos para vos echar Kadish. David Chaim, he survived Auschwitz. What I find to be so provocative and powerful about this poem is, think about it for a moment. Why does he want to survive? It's not so he can go home. It's not so he can see his house again. It's not so he can walk the street, walk along the sea of the city that he had known, that his family had lived in for so long. It is, he needs to survive so he can recite the Kaddish, so he can properly mourn the loss of his family that had been destroyed. Between March and August of 1943, 20% of the city of Salonika disappeared. And that's actually the term that is used in Greek, exaphanistikon. They disappeared. Didn't say they were violently ripped away from the city, as many of the Christians looked on. They disappeared. Nearly 50,000 Jews, almost all to Auschwitz. One group of Jews were able to present Spanish passports, and they had the privilege, because Spain was neutral, of not being deported to Auschwitz. So they had the privilege, this was a privilege, they got to go to Bergen-Belsen instead. In Auschwitz, and I want to wrap up, I don't want to get too much into the experience of the camps, but I do want to offer 2 examples and then close, because we're getting to the time here. Which is, Primo Levi had some very interesting observations to make about the Jews from Salonika, because, you know, they were different in some ways. They did not speak Yiddish, they did not speak German, they did not speak Polish, they largely could not communicate with the other inmates there, or with the guards, with the Poles or the Germans. He says, next to us, there's a group of Greeks, those admirable and terrible Jews of Salonika, tenacious, thieving, wise, ferocious and united, so determined to live, such pitiless opponents in the struggle for life. Those Greeks who have conquered in the kitchens and in the yards, and whom even the Germans respect and the Poles fear. They were in their they were in their 3rd year of camp, and nobody knows better than they what the camp means. They now stand closely in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, and sing one of their interminable chants. And he represents, it's kind of a little bit of an Orientalist image. The Greeks, they're terrible and thieving, they're ferocious. You know, they come from the Mediterranean world. They're not accustomed to the cold of the winter, but they are accustomed to working with the hands. Many of them are port workers. Many of them are strong. Some of them are boxers. Some of them are veterans of the Greek military. When they come together and they chant their songs, in which language are they singing? Are they singing in their Ladino? Are they singing in Greek? Some of those Jews become selected precisely because they cannot communicate with the other prisoners. They cannot communicate, it is believed, with the outside world. So the Nazi officials, the SS, specifically select Jews from Salonika and Greece in disproportionate numbers to serve in the most atrocious role available in the entire death camp of Auschwitz, which is the Sonderkommando. This was the battalion that was responsible for escorting prisoners to the gas chambers and to transferring the corpses from the gas chambers to the crematoria. And it is Jews from Salonika and Greece joining up with other Jews in the crematoria brigade, the Sonderkommando, who participate in one of the only uprisings in Auschwitz, the Zondagon Commando uprising in the autumn of 1944. And they are successful. They destroy a crematoria. They are able to kill a couple of SS guards, but they are quickly put down. And when the perpetrators of this uprising are lined up for execution, a bullet to the head, there are accounts that suggest they did the following. The Greek Jews among them, they began to sing. And what did they sing? They sang the Greek national anthem. You say, why? Why? Why the Greek national anthem? You're there because you're Jews. You were there because you were deported, because you were Jews, as your Greek Christian neighbors largely stood by. They expropriated your property. They destroyed your cemetery. They destroyed your synagogues. And there you are, singing the Greek national anthem. It's a very interesting puzzle. Does it mean, is it to say, you think you have us here because we are Jews, but we are also Greeks, or we are Greek Jews? We are Greek too. We are humans, perhaps, is the message. We have many complexities to our identities, to ourselves. The Jews of Greece in total face one of the highest mortality rates of all those countries under Nazi occupation. In Salonika, of the 50,000 Jews on the eve of the war, only 2,000 survived. Some survived Auschwitz. Others survived in hiding, some fighting with the communist resistance in particular. And they faced very, very difficult circumstances when they arrived because their homes were being occupied by Greek Christians. Their synagogues had been dismantled by the Greek Christians. And the civil war engulfed the country. There were very serious reprisals against Greek Christian civilians by the Nazi occupation forces. It was a very terrible and difficult time. Greece was decimated. Industry. But it goes, why? Why such a high rate of death in Greece in general? And I think it goes, again, to think about the global story of the Holocaust through the local factors that are at play that begin to help us to explain why different communities had different fates. It has to do not only with the general scheme of the final solution, but its implementation and the role of the local societies, the local governments, and those who stood by. They were not so much bystanders, they were also implicated. They were impacted violently too, in very difficult circumstances. And those tensions turned to violence. And I think help us explain the fate of the Jews of Greece. The Jewish story of Salonika in Greece did not end in 1945. There remains today a Jewish community that is a testament to its roots. There's a Jewish museum, there's a Jewish school, there's a synagogue. There are 1,000 Jews in a city of 1 million. 100 years ago, there were 80,000 Jews in a city of 150,000. There were 60 synagogues, now there's 2. So the entire universe has been transformed, but the story of the Jews of Greece, the story of the Jews of Salonika, the story of the Sephardic Jews there and beyond has not yet come to an end. Thanks for your attention.
Wow, I hear in my ears a resounding applause, even though we can't see the audience or hear them. Thank you, Devin Naar. What an incredible talk and journey through a part of history that I'm ashamed to have not known very much about. I knew a little, but you have taught us tremendously. There are a number of questions, and I think I've been trying to collate them, but some people are writing, "You have my applause." Many, many thanks, a number of people. I'm just going to walk through the questions that are posed and see how we go. So one person asked sort of factual questions. How do you spell? Oh, Devin, I think you need to stop sharing your screen
Oh,
because
okay,
I'm
sure.
a voice in the dark there. I
Okay.
think I'm maybe visible now, although I think I'd rather look at that wedding, which I'd love to hear you describe. But so somebody asked, how do you spell Conseja, Konseija, and is soletrio written from left to right or right to left?
Oh, Conseja. Oh,
Conseja, sorry.
Conseja, well, it depends. Conseja is Kuf, Vav, Nun, Samech, Yud, Zayin with a chupchik, Hey, or Konseja would be what I
Okay.
said. And Ladino, when it's written in Hebrew letters, is written right to left, like Hebrew. It's a great question. So just like Yiddish. I mean, if you think about it historically, cultures write whatever language they speak in the alphabet of their sacred text. So that's why in the Catholic world in Europe and its Protestant tributaries, everybody writes whatever language they write in the Latin alphabet, because that was the alphabet that you would become literate in. Jews, wherever they lived, they wrote whatever language they were speaking in the Hebrew alphabet. So Yiddish is in Hebrew, Ladino historically in Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic in Hebrew, and Muslim, same thing. That's why Urdu is historically in Arabic, is in Arabic script. Farsi in Arabic script, Turkish historically in Arabic script. So to write a language that you speak, whatever the language is, in the language of your religious sacred texts is a very common phenomenon across societies. And for Ladino, that's the case. I would just add that in the 20th century, there was a movement to try to modernize or westernize both Turkish, which was transformed from using Hebrew letters to using Latin letters under Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, who, by the way, was born in Salonika. And Jews also did the same. They also began to write Ladino in the Hebrew alphabet, or there's a whole big debate also about the name of the language, which is a different topic. But they began to write the language in whichever, in Latin letters, according to a variety of different styles as well.
So a colleague at Penn asked, offered a correction, I think. You mentioned that Salonika port laborers went to the port of Jaffa, but the correction says that 3,000 porters went from Salonika to Palestine because they were brought to work at the new modern port in Haifa, not Tel Aviv, by the labor leader Abba Hushi, who became eventually the mayor of Haifa.
Yeah, if I could just, that is true. There, some were brought to Haifa, but also some went to Tel Aviv as well. So you can find in Tel Aviv was one of the major, the Salonican there are Salonican congregations still today in Tel Aviv and in Haifa. So in both of those places, you had Salonican stevedores wound up there, although they had a great difficulty, in fact, and due to, as we are familiar with, some racism in Palestinian Jewish society under the British Mandate, and still today. So we have also many Salonican Jews, a certain number of Salonican Jews actually returned to Salonika because they could not make it in Palestine.
Wow. So one questioner asked three questions or comments, so I'm just going to read them all and let you address them. I think they're related. I wonder if you can address the work camps that existed for some of the men deported from Salonika after July 1941, specifically in Thebes. Let me just ask the three questions and you can respond. What knowledge or documentations do we have about this camp? I mean, July 1942, following the Black Shabbat. And also you speak of many omens before 1942, July. How do you understand the psychology of the community that did not see these omens even before the Nazis occupied?
Great. I mean, I off the top of my head, I don't know if I could comment specifically on Thebes, but I could say that in terms of the work camps, they were generally working on various munition enterprises, including like railways. So you have many Jews. There are some images even. We have illustrations of Jews working on the railroads outside of the city in very terrible conditions. Some would eventually be able to come back to Salonika, where they would be serviced by the only Jewish institution that was permitted to continue to operate throughout the German occupation, which was the Matanot Levionim, which was effectively the Jewish soup kitchen. And actually, I discovered in my family letters that it was to the council of the Jewish soup kitchen that my great uncle Solomon, who I mentioned in the beginning, was appointed. And that winds up explaining why he and his family wind up remaining in Salonika very close to the end. They leave on the 17th of 19 transports because my uncle Solomon was responsible for distributing yogurt and milk to the sick and elderly as they boarded the trains to Auschwitz. In terms of the other question, I'm sorry, can you just remind me the second part was?
Let's see. Let's see. Also, you speak of omens before July
omens, yeah.
1942. Why didn't the community respond to the omens?
It's a great. I mean, this is a very an often asked question, and I think the way in which I framed it maybe suggests the kind of teleology that I don't mean to suggest, because I think they could not fathom what was going to come, is number one. Number two, the idea of deportation in this region is not new. Deportation was a mechanism of population control and ethnic engineering. So the idea that a group, that a community would be excised from a certain geography and brought to another geography, for example, in the name of nation state building or imperial building or something like that, would strike them as not like completely out of the blue. In other words, thinking about the exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey. Before then, there were even population transfers between Bulgaria and Greece and Turkey going back to the Balkan Wars. So we have some sense that people were able to rationalize that process through this relatively recent history. Another way to think about this phenomenon is the way in which just an absence of understanding of what was going on. I mean, I think for Greece, it was really outside in some ways of some of the other mechanisms, because Greece did not on its own implement Nuremberg laws, even though it did have Nuremberg style laws already in place as a result of the Ottoman legacy. So for example, in Greece, inherited the absence of separation of church and state from the Ottoman Empire. And as part of that, it also did not introduce civil marriage. So marriage, for example, was the exclusive jurisdiction of religious authorities. So it was illegal for Jews, Muslims, and Christians to marry each other. So we have some evidence from Nazi officials observing this, and this is fantastic. And they say, look, Greece is the only country that we're occupying where we don't have to stop Jews and Christians from marrying each other. They already don't marry each other. The only problem that the Nazi officials had with the way that Greece operated in terms of marriage was that they permitted conversion. So if you converted from one religion to another, you could marry somebody of the other, born into the other faith. But so this, this sort of set up a kind of a dynamic that was like a little bit different from elsewhere in Europe. So on the one hand, there's the sense of separation between the communities that was already existent. But on the other hand, there was a sense of integration. As I alluded to, Jews were being integrated into public schools in Greece and in Salonika, when Jews in other parts of Europe were being kicked out. And we have one of the leaders of the community, a historian, Mikhail Molcho, writing in 1940, he says that he speaks about the Emek HaBaha, the valley of tears of Jewish history. Our Jewish brothers are experiencing tears all throughout Europe. But here in Greece, we are in a valley of joy. I mean, he was overstating it a bit, but by comparison, he says, we do not see this sharp level of violent anti-Semitism, of anti-Semitic measures. So they were not prepared in that regard. It was a break. And the third point I would make is that there was a lot of attention paid to the role that the chief rabbi played in this period. So the chief rabbi at this time was actually, and I write extensively about this in my book. All of these topics I touch on in my book, if you're interested in really getting into it deep. I talk a little bit about the chief rabbi, who's this guy by the name of Zvi Koretz, who was born in Poland and educated in Germany. And he was hired by the Jewish community in 1933 because the leaders of the Jewish community believed they sort of internalized their own inferiority as being not really European. And they thought that really only a European born and trained spiritual leader, political leader, could usher the Jews of Salonika into the modern age, into the European space, and make them on a par with the other European Jewish communities. As an Ashkenazi Jew, as a foreigner, as a fluent speaker of German, he cultivated relatively close relations with the German occupation authorities, and he encouraged the Jewish masses to abide by the expectations of the occupation forces, to not run away, to not rebel. And for this reason, he has been accused by the Jewish community in the wake of the war, and subsequently in the collective memory of the Jewish community, of being a collaborationist, of betraying the community. So much so, this is something else that is very distinctive about the case of Greece and Salonika, so much so that after the war, there was a court case brought by the Jewish community against Jewish collaborators in Greek state court. Courts had already died just after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, but there were 40 other Jews who were listed among collaborators, the head of the Judenrat and the Jewish police. And the Jewish community brought them to court and compelled the Greek state to execute several Jews for the crime of collaboration and imprison several others. In no other country did this take place. There were the Kazner trials in Israel and other things like that, in which the Israeli state as a Jewish body adjudicated the guilt of prospective collaborators. But it was only in Greece where the Jewish community essentially delegated this responsibility, requested that the Greek state get involved in adjudicating this question of collaboration.
Thank you. Comment from an audience member. My mother was an Auschwitz survivor. She told me about the Greek girls in the camp. You're correct. They could not communicate. They couldn't survive the cold of Poland. A question asks, were the conversias, the doenme, treated differently by the Nazis?
It's a great question. So the doenme are, just to make sure we're on the same page. So there was an important Jewish charismatic leader in the 17th century in the Ottoman Empire, a guy by the name of Shabbatai Tzvi. And long story short is he is proclaimed the Messiah. It becomes a very big problem in the Ottoman Empire. And the Sultan brings him in and gives him the ultimatum of either being executed or converting to Islam. So he converts to Islam, and there's a whole theology developed as to why a Jewish Messiah needs to convert to Islam under duress. A group of several hundred of his closest and most adept followers follow suit and convert to Islam. And they establish, so they're formally Muslim, but genealogically and to some extent still culturally and theologically Jewish. They establish their own community known as the Dunme, which is a Turkish term. It's a little bit derogatory. It kind of means turncoat. It's sometimes also used in Turkish as a derogatory term to refer to trans people. You can maybe see the connection there. So they called themselves the Sabbatians or the Ma'aminim, the believers in Hebrew. And what's fascinating is during that exchange of populations that are referred to between Greece and Turkey after World War I, remember, the only criteria according to which you're going to stay or go is religion. There are some exceptions in different parts of Greece and Turkey, but essentially there's only one exception, only one criteria, which is religion. And in this context, The Donmei, the Sabbatians are counted as Muslims, and they are expelled from Greece, and they are sent to Turkey. So there were essentially no Ma'aminim, no Donmei left in Greece by the time of the Second World War, and so they are not involved in that experience.
A question. Somebody visited the Jewish Museum in Salonika about 8 years ago, and the museum staff told them that visitors from Turkey would come and tell them that their family had unusual customs and wondered if their ancestors were Jewish. But the archives of the community were destroyed in the fire, and they couldn't help with the investigation. What about the incidents of such Marano type experiences?
So this is again a reference to the Donmei. I mean, if you think about it, like this is really a community of transformation over the generations, because you have the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, but some of those Jews wind up in Portugal or otherwise are baptized as Christians, and some of them go to the Ottoman Empire and become Jews again. And then some of those people who had been Jewish became Catholic and then became Jewish again, also then become Muslim as a result of this conversion of Shabbatai Tzvi. And then they are expelled from Greece on the grounds that they're Muslim. And so there is little documentation available in Salonika as a result of the fire that was mentioned, the fire of 1917. But there is quite a lot of documentation from the period after 1917 until the Second World War. And I spent 10 years essentially trying to find the archives of the Jewish community of Salonika. And that's a whole nother saga. It was really, really fascinating. I had to go to Jerusalem and Salonika, Athens, Moscow. Some of the stuff wound up in the former Soviet secret military archives in Moscow, Washington, D.C., and other places. But because, for the same reason that I just alluded to, the Donmei were not considered Jewish. And because religion was the official bureaucratic criteria for the organization of Salonican, Ottoman, and even Greek society, the prohibition, civil marriage was introduced in Greece only in 1982. So until 1982, you could not marry across religions. Okay, it's like Israel today. Israel has the inheritance of the Ottoman law, which delegates civil status to the religious courts, essentially. But in the context of Salonika, there are no references to Muslims in the Jewish community record, so you wouldn't find much there. But some of the papers and documents of the Donmei community were entrusted with several of the leaders of the Jewish community when some of the Donmei were being expelled, and some of those Jewish leaders later brought some of the Donmei archives to Israel, and those became the manuscripts that became the basis for Gershom Sholom's very famous history of Shabbatai Tzvi and the Sabbatian movement come from those documents. So on the genealogical issue, though, I would say that some people who are descended from Donmeis, I know of at least one person, has been able to demonstrate that they are genealogically Sephardic, genealogically Jewish, and therefore eligible for Spanish citizenship according to the new laws that were passed in 2015 by Spain and Portugal that offered citizenship to the descendants of Spanish Jews, and have subsequently gotten Spanish passports. So they were able to somehow demonstrate their Jewish and Salonican genealogical bona fides.
Through through gene analysis of DNA.
I think through family papers and state documents, you can still piece some things together. Yeah. And I think also DNA, but I don't think DNA was accepted as a primary way to demonstrate your Sephardicness for the Spanish and Portuguese citizenship laws.
Okay, but how many people? There's another question about how between the destruction by the fire of 1917 and the destruction of the cemetery, how else can somebody trace the genealogy of descendants of the Salonican Jews?
Well, so it's difficult. This is one of my areas of interest. I have actually been invited to do some of these celebrity, family history shows. So I recently did one for Diane van Furstenberg, the famous clothing designer. Her mother was Nachmias from Salonika, an Auschwitz survivor. And then I did one for the TV personality and singer Leah Michelle, who's also from Salonika. And so it was very funny because, well, a couple of things. First of all, after the fire of 1917, the Jewish community created a census of everybody living in the city, all the Jews living in the city. So they counted 74,000 Jews, and some, but not all of the registers of that census survived. So we have information for maybe like 20,000 Jews that go back to people born in the 1840s, 1850s. So there's one kind of source. There's also municipal records which survived the fire. So after 1914, when the Greek state started taking records of the community, and so that gives you births, marriages, and deaths. So that can get you a little bit back into the 19th century. And if you're fortunate enough to be from a prominent rabbinic family, you might be able to trace your family a little bit there. And if you're interested, please email me. I can give you some tips and guidance if you're looking for certain family names or something like that.
Okay. And there is, I think this is probably the last question. Somebody says that, oh, there's another one as well. And I'll ask really quickly. We have 3 minutes left. Who do you know more about the soldier who was commemorated in the prayer book for the schools? Raphael Angel or Angel. This person has the name, the maiden name of Angel. My father,
well,
she says, was from Rhodes.
Well, I would say that the name Angel in Salonika, and no, it's okay, don't worry. In Salonika and Rhodes doesn't really narrow it down too much. So it's a very well-known and widely disseminated name. Please feel free, to email me. I'd be very interested in being in touch with you and learning more. There is a well-known rabbi whose family is from Rhodes in the United States, in New York, the Rabbi Emeritus of Congregation Shereth Israel. His name is Mark Angel, as they say in the American pronunciation. Perhaps you're connected to him on the Rhodes side, but there are many, I'd be very interested, many Rhodes families. Be happy to try to help you, direct you in the right place.
And a former student of yours, Francis Johnson, asks, do you know about the Apulian Jews in Salonika? What happened to the Apulia quarter?
Well, so this brings us to another theme, which is very interesting when we think about the history of the Jews of Salonika and other parts of the Ottoman Empire, is that when Jews settled in these places, they tended to establish congregations that they would name after the place from which they came. So in Salonika, for example, you had a Catalan synagogue, and you had a Lisbon synagogue, and you had a Bora, and you had Castilla. And then, of course, all of these you had Catalan Hadash y Yashan. You had the old one and the new one because the leaders would inevitably get into some kind of conflict and they would split. There's this Ladino expression, dos Judios, tres keilot, which exists in other languages too. 2 Jews, 3 synagogues. They had their own disputes. So until the 20th century, though, there was some sense of connection to these congregations. In fact, until World War II, if you were getting registered for your marriage, you would be registered according to your synagogue affiliation, according to your congregational affiliation, whether or not you still went to that congregation. They're all destroyed after the fire of 1917 anyhow, some were rebuilt. But the very idea that there would be some kind of connection or some kind of almost atavistic memory of a connection to this place and to this congregation was maintained in some places with specific customs. So like we have in the 1920s, for example, the republication of the Aragon Sidur, and of the Catalan Sidur, and of some of the other specific liturgical rites of each of these miniature communities inside of Salonika. So Francis, I'd be happy to talk to you more about the fate of these different congregations and their customs and their geographic representation. It'd be great to connect again.
Well, I think our time is up, and we have enjoyed your I'm just looking, there might be one more comment here. Anyway, we have enjoyed your talk very, very much and learned, yes, hearty thanks from many people. Bravo, and thank you so much for enlightening us in a sobering and sad way, but may we commemorate the Jews of Salonika and Athens and Bulgaria and continue expanding our knowledge. Thank you very much, Devin Naar. And thank you to
My
the
pleasure.
audience for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.